I recently saw a comment in a PC building post on a page that really kind of triggered this video. And somebody basically asked, hey, does brand matter, or is one brand better than another? And the comment that really sort of triggered this video said, it doesn't effing matter, they're all exactly the same. Today we're going to talk about how they're not exactly the same and what you need to think about when you're shopping for parts for your PC. Introducing the XTM3 from Fantex, micro ATX chassis built for power and performance. Compact yet packed with potential, the XTM3 features support for rear connect motherboards, dedicated radiator space at the top, and triple fan locations at the bottom to help keep your GPU cool. With its innovative layout and sleek, clean design, the XTM3 is ready to take on almost any gaming PC configuration and cooling challenge. Check out the link in the description for more details. Now, the funny thing about that statement is it's like maybe 5% right and 95% tomfoolery. I don't know what other word to use for it. Actually, it just screams non-experience is what it screams. Let's talk about a couple of major components. We'll talk about the major components here. We're not going to talk about cases. RAM, look, as long as the RAM is on the QVL for your motherboard, it's pretty much guaranteed to work at the speeds that are advertised on the RAM. So a set of RAM that is able to do 6,000 mega transfers at CL28 is going to perform exactly like another set of RAM that does 6,000 mega transfers, CL28, if it's on the QVL list. So that brand at that point doesn't necessarily matter because it's not the kind of component that is having huge fluctuations in the way that it performs. For instance, like a graphics card and the cooler designs, or motherboards and the VRM designs and the VRM coolers and such. So let's go ahead and start with motherboards here real quick, because a Z790 board for Intel is not equivalent to another Z790 motherboard from Intel. Motherboard manufacturers have a huge range of build quality when it comes to motherboards. And the reason for that is it has to do with the cost of building the board, the cost of the materials, and the feature sets that are built into them. If you look at a motherboard and you say, well, that Z790 is going to be the same as another Z790 when it comes to like an MSI board versus an Asus board versus an ASRock board versus a ECS board versus whatever other brands you want to put, Gigabyte, Aorus, doesn't matter, right? They are not equivalent. The only reason that number is on the box is to tell you what chipset is in that motherboard. That is the only thing that gives them an equal playing ground when it comes to the chipset capabilities. Even then, it's not perfectly level when it comes to the playing ground, because as we recently talked about with bifurcation and such, not all motherboards even utilize the CPU lanes in ways that they can when it comes to the CPU manufacturer. Sometimes they make really stupid decisions. But let's talk about now, I've got about 35 years experience in terms of paying attention to this sort of stuff. I really got into this when I was a teenager, and starting to realize what some of the differences were between brands and what sort of the give and take is with certain brands. So for instance, on motherboard side, when it comes to Asus, Asus is like a premium brand. Now Asus has a much wider range of product than they used to. In fact, back in the day, Asus kind of had like a small, medium, large when it came to their product stacks. But Asus also adds a lot of stuff on the motherboard that can quickly drive cost up, but is not going to necessarily translate to a better user experience. Now, things that matter are going to be like VRM cooling and design, right? So this is a Maximus board right here. Actually, I take that back. This is a Dark Hero board right here. Big beefy VRM coolers and overbuilt VRM delivery system, because this board is designed towards overclocking. If I was going to be going with a brand specifically for overclocking motherboards, as much as Asus has kind of got a serious black eye when it comes specifically to like their RMA experiences and their quick deniability of denying RMAs, they still have a better product when it comes to overclocking CPUs. And that doesn't matter if it's AMD or Intel as far as I'm concerned. I feel like their BIOS is more intuitive when it comes to understanding overclocking features. And I feel like when it comes to just the overall build quality of the board, dollar for dollar, compared to something like, say, let's say this was an AMD board and it's an X870E board. At a $500 Asus X870E, I feel like you're gonna get a better quality board than, say, the ASRock Taichi X870E. You can insert all of the ASRock like fiasco right now regarding AMD X3D CPUs. Yeah, we won't get into that one, but there's an example of why brand matters, because brands have a lot of flexibility on how they can build their product. So when it comes to overall reliability, that is the number one thing I think shoppers should consider when it comes to picking their brand. I think unfortunately a lot of shoppers pick what looks prettiest, and then they find out quickly later on that, well, pretty didn't equate to reliable and or, working if you will. So this is an example right here. This is a Gigabyte Z790 UD AC board. And then this right here is the Z790 Dark from Asus. And obviously there's a huge build quality difference between these two. I'll bring this one out in a second. In fact, this Gigabyte board was so terrible in the BIOS side of things is why I took it out of our PC case testing rig, like the hardware we use when we do our PC case temperature testing, because the BIOS on this was just absolutely driving me insane. Not to mention there's a huge price difference between these two as well. But I just want to show you now, the UD or the ultra durable series, which Gigabyte was heavily known for back in like the Phenom and the like FX series when it came to AMD, I don't feel like that's truly translated over to the current builds when it comes to their motherboards. Like this looks like a giant overbuilt VRM cooler right here, but it's actually very, very thin. And if you count the amount of phases on this, it's actually quite low. In fact, it's kind of like the bare minimum when it comes to what Intel requires. But you can see right here, the chipset cooler is barely there. And then, like I said, when it came to the BIOS quality on this board, it was doing some weird things with my CPU. It's a 13900K that we use for our CPU testing inside of a case airflow thermal testing. It was so sporadic and was like having such fluctuating scores, even at lockdown settings, that I just had to remove it entirely because of the fact that I couldn't trust what it was doing. And right now I can't trust that it will even fit back in its box, whatever. This right here though, Asus is also not off the hook of putting out some really crappy things hidden under the name of something good. Like for instance, Prime, I say something good. Prime is their baseline model. It's like their bottom spec when it comes to their graphics cards or their motherboards. But this right here might be one of the saddest excuses of a motherboard that I have personally ever seen. Now the B650 chipset is an amazing chipset for AMD. It gets you most of the features that you would need from like X870 or X670, but obviously it's cut down a little bit to try and help with costs. Speaking of cut down, I didn't even touch this thing without getting stabbed. Speaking of cut down, this might be one of the jankiest VRM designs and cooler designs that I've ever seen on a motherboard. In fact, for instance, this B650M motherboard was supposed to be our new server board, if you guys remember that video, where we needed to add more SATA ports. There's only 4 included. That's fine. Most modern motherboards don't include a lot of SATA ports. In fact, some of the most modern ones now only include 2 SATA ports because SATA has quickly been phased out. But you can see right here, we have 4 16x length slots. Only the top one's actually a 16x. The 3 bottom are PCI Express 1x. Like, why the heck do you have the long slots on here and it's 1x? That means any device that you plug in there is only gonna run at PCI Express 1x. So that ended up being a problem for us because when we were running a 4 or 6 SATA channel controller on there, it was literally chopping that down to 1x, which was actually giving us a total throughput bandwidth limitation to even SATA drives. Spinning hard drive SATA drives. So it was actually so bad that we ended up ditching this board entirely. And here's the problem. This is still like a $130 motherboard. Back in the day, a $99 motherboard used to be all you needed to spend, and you still got full feature sets with that. Not 1x slots masquerading as a 16x. So stuff like this, you look at the box, you're like, oh cool, it's got at least 8x. Nope, not even 4x. 1x. It's ridiculous. So this is an example of how brand matters, but you still have to pay attention within the brand because of the fact that they will pull stuff like this. Motherboards are one thing. They have a huge variance when it comes to their feature sets, their design sets, their VRMs, the amount of M.2 slots. Like I showed you, the amount of 16x-ish slots masquerading as 1x or 1x masquerading as 16x. But where this particular discussion started was graphics cards. Now, this is the only area where I say this guy that was like, it doesn't matter, they're all the freaking same, is 5% correct. Because they're all the same in the sense that they all share the exact same die from whatever GPU family it is that they exist from, whether it's NVIDIA or AMD. But let's talk about some of the differences between the brands that brands are known for. I've got 3 brands up here that I think, and I don't have a Gigabyte, but I should. I've got 3 brands right here that I think represent a pretty good chunk of the market. We've got Asus, we've got MSI, and we've got Zotac. Asus is a premium brand, and they definitely market themselves as such. Now they do have 3 product categories with 50 series. They've got Prime, they've got Tough / Strix now, because Strix used to be the top end. Now they've actually dropped that down one. Whereas now the Astral is like the top end. Astral is like the new Strix, okay? But ASUS charges a huge premium. In fact, it's very difficult to even find an ASUS MSRP board these days when it comes to graphics cards, even with the price drops. Now, what you typically get because of their beefier cooler and their beefier VRM design, because remember, the only thing that this has to conform to when it comes to NVIDIA specification is the RAM arrangement and then the core design itself. Power phases and all that sort of stuff, that's fully up to the brand to implement how they want. They can use the components they want, they can build the VRM design however they want, and as long as they're using the 12-volt high power connector or 12-volt 2x6, which really sort of sucks because that's the PCI SIG standard. Everything else is within the brand to design however the heck they want to. Because ASUS tends to go with more premium products in their boards, I know it sounds like an ASUS ad, but it's just not, this is the truth. Their prices are significantly higher. But because of that, you get more power limit available, which means for overclocking purposes, if you want to allow the board to draw more power, specifically if we're talking under a 5090, 5090 is already at the limitation of the cable spec, so none of those boards are allowed to go farther unless you do like custom mods to the board. You get better overclocking support, usually better cooling and such. MSI for the longest time, even on the 4090s, 4090 had additional power limit available to it because the 100% power limit on a 4090 was actually 450 watts, not 600 watts like you have on the 5090. But even our 4090 MSI boards, even the water-cooled ones, you're paying a huge premium for, up to $1,000 over MSRP, but they had no additional power limit available to them at all. Like they still were limiting themselves to 450 watts on the board. And that's almost because it seemed like the MSI brand was scared of NVIDIA's involvement, if you will. So MSI, and yes, I know this is a 1060, it's just really the first card I grabbed that had an MSI logo on it. The brand has chosen to be more conservative when it comes to overclockability of the boards and such. Now Zotac has been definitely one of those brands that is absolutely no frills as far as I'm concerned. In fact, the Zotac cards for the most part have had lockdown power limits. Heck, a lot of them had even not even included like RGB or whatnot, unless you went with like a more high-end model like this one here. I forget the model name of this one. This is the, yeah, you had the Trinity, which is technically one of their high-end cards, but Zotac charges a premium because again, every third-party manufacturer charges a premium over the quote-unquote Founders Edition or reference models because they are designing this thing from the ground up with the exception of the die that they're just plugging down on the substrate and the whole circuit design, which is designed by NVIDIA. They want to charge more because they want to make money on their stuff. They can't produce it as cheap as NVIDIA can produce their cards because they have to buy the dies, NVIDIA does not. So all of these brands charge a premium. The question is whether or not you are getting anything for that additional money. So it's not true that it's all the same and it doesn't matter. I have some recommendations here though, because I know right now you guys are probably hearing like, Jay, that's a lot of blah, 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 but you really haven't said anything regarding what brands matter and what brands you can trust. Trust is one of those things that, in my opinion, has to be earned. And a lot of brands have a tarnished trust values because of the way negative information spreads so fast. There is not a single brand that I can put on this table right now that someone won't chime in and say, they suck, they're terrible, blah, blah, blah. And then they'll say, I think you should get a such and such instead. And then someone else will be like, screw such and such, they suck because blah, 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 get this guy instead. And then someone else will chime in and be like, no, screw them, they suck. Nobody can ever agree unanimously that there's a brand that you can trust. Like that's just, so we need to throw trust, I don't wanna say out the window, but you need to be careful about the stories you're listening to about trust and try and vet whether or not you are hearing information that is firsthand versus seventh hand. Because people really like to repeat stories without any firsthand knowledge of the way things actually went down. Now, I'm not saying that that means that all these brands haven't earned some of the hate that they get, because every single brand has, as long as I've been doing YouTube in 13 years, has fumbled and mishandled things in ways that creates a brand tarnishing and a distrust. There are other brands that have, unfortunately aren't around anymore, that have done things that have given just wide range trust. In fact, EVGA is that brand that I'm thinking of, and it really sucks that they're not around anymore because EVGA had so many stories of going above and beyond to make customers happy. Unfortunately, even EVGA has people that'll chime in and say, no, EVGA sucks, they did this and blah, 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 blah. But you start to notice a diminishing percentage of people saying that versus certain brands than others. Brands that I think you can trust today, I feel like that list is getting thinner and thinner as we go. I'll tell you who I feel like has actually made a pretty good turnaround on some of the brand perception and brand trust. That's actually MSI. MSI for a long time had the RMA woes that I think every big brand goes through at one point, but what really hurt MSI's image for a long time was they were allegedly caught selling directly to Bitcoin mining farms during the extreme supply and demand issues during and after COVID. That is what number one hurt the brand so bad. I say allegedly because even to this day, apparently it's not been explicitly stated. Apparently there was an apology that went out, but at the same time, now we're talking about a distrust because of an ethics thing rather than a direct consumer affected problem of, I sent my motherboard in for RMA, it was perfectly fine, I took photos, no bent pins, and then suddenly I get an email saying, we're not gonna RMA your board, you have bent pins. And at that point, you know, what the hell, bro? I have photos of it not bent, you bent it. And then there's all those accusations that'll go around of, well, the brand is intentionally damaging boards so they don't have to cover it. Which, it's unfortunate, but I've had people reach out to me in RMA departments at some of these brands and say, that is absolutely positively what happens. In fact, there's even incentives sometimes for the RMA reps to limit the amount of claims that they're covering, and they get a bonus for it. So yeah, that's definitely hard to trust. Now the problem is I can't validate that information. That's text on a screen that someone wrote me. How am I supposed to vet that and validate that? But I feel like MSI has definitely made a huge jump in their trustworthiness, if you will. I haven't had an MSI product not work as it's supposed to. In fact, I've been using an MSI motherboard on a few, I can't remember which stations, but there's a few of my stations that have an MSI motherboard. I think my daughter's rig at home is even running an MSI motherboard. Haven't had any problems there. I haven't run an MSI graphics card in a while, but MSI is one of those brands that I haven't felt lately has been getting a lot of hate. And it's funny, if you really want to think about the brands right now that are doing good, think about the ones you're hearing about the least. Because no one online ever goes online to say, I had a great experience from this brand. No, hate sells. Rage bait works. There's certain channels that do that, and you know which those channels are. But rage bait works, and rage bait sells, and rage bait gets people going. So if you think about a brand that you're not hearing about a lot, that's sometimes a good sign, right? Because especially when it comes to online, people just want to talk about their horror stories. No one ever wants to give credit where credit is due. But it's funny, I think if you were to go into, let's say you belong to some of these PC groups and you go in there and make a poll, or you just ask hey everyone, what's your most trustworthy brand? Sit back, get your popcorn and just read. And I'll be honest with you, you'll leave feeling well, the entire PC industry's fucked. Which some people might even make a video saying that, but it's not. It's not. Every brand is gonna have its ups and it's gonna have its downs, and they're all doing it at different intervals, and so it's gonna always feel like somebody's screwing up because somebody always is screwing up. But brand trustworthiness is something that you have to research. And to be honest, for most consumers, you don't have enough experience. I feel like people aren't buying and selling and building PCs at a high enough rate to really get a true picture of what brand reliability is. I feel like the place to get the best information about brand reliability, it's from SIs, because they are dealing with high volume. They're dealing with high volume, every single family, every single generation refresh when it comes to product. And I can tell you, I've talked to some of these SIs, and there is definitely a recurring theme when it comes to failure rates and such. But I feel like every single year that failure rate brand is changing. Because what's supposed to happen is when a problem is identified, you are supposed to identify said problem and fix it. The problem is brands are not transparent about any of that because they are terrified that if they admit fault at anything, that is just going to be the cancellation and demise of their entire brand. And it's not. EVGA was a perfect example of having issues in the past and handling them in a way that only bolstered brand trust by also admitting, hey, this is happening, this is what we found, and this is what we're doing about it. That is all brands have to do. And when it comes to brands mattering, yes, they all do vary in the way that they're designed. They all do vary in the way that they value their own products, if you will. And some brands definitely overvalue their products. Zotac kind of being one of them. Like just do a search for Zotac brand value, or Zotac failure rates, etc. You'll find it fluctuates all over the place. But it's one of those things too, where you got to consider if you're now looking for information like, okay, what's a failure? Like, how many failures am I seeing of a certain brand? There's a reason why you'll see ASUS listed. It's not because the brands necessarily suck. It's because of the volume. See, I've had this conversation with ASUS quite a bit, especially when we have been trying to slowly reestablish a discussion and relationship with them on, hey, here are the problems that the community's had. Here's the problems that we've had. What are you guys doing to fix it? Brands like ASUS take a long time to implement change. They are a giant flywheel with a lot of weight that takes forever for anything to happen and change policy-wise. But they were also very forthcoming in providing non-public figures on the products that have sold and the volume of which they sold and what the failure rate of those products have been. They fall within the same percentage rate as any other brand. It's just, if the numbers are to be believed, they outsell like every other brand, like 6 to 10 to 1, depending on the product. So it's one of those things where sometimes perception, if you might hear like ASUS failing. Well, if a person's selling 10 times more than everyone else and they have a 1.5% failure rate, I think that's really high. I think it's lower than that. And you have a Zotac here selling, 2 graphics cards for every 20 of ASUS, and they have a 1.5% failure rate. Obviously, you're going to hear about one brand more than another. I'm just throwing those names out there. This is not like a pro ASUS discussion. It's just that is the way it is. Like, they do sell more product than anybody else. But I think at the end of the day, you should worry a little less about each particular brand that you're getting, and make sure that the component that you're getting, one, has a decent user satisfaction. Like, it doesn't matter if you go to Newegg or you go to Amazon or whatever. I would look at those user reviews more so than anything anyone's posting on Reddit or any of that, because I feel like verified buyer is important, because then you can just skip all of the regurgitated so-and-so said this, so-and-so said that, and then passing it off as firsthand knowledge. As long as the component does what you need it to do, it fits in your price point, and it has a solid reliability rating, it doesn't matter as far as I'm concerned that it's MSI, Gigabyte, Zotac, ASUS. It doesn't matter. In fact, there was a day I swore I would never use another MSI motherboard, which is why it's funny that I'm saying MSI, I feel like, has made huge strides in kind of repairing a lot of their brand image. It was when I was running the MSI, I can't remember which chipset it was, but it was a Godlike board. Yeah, Godlike. Do you know how expensive Godlike boards are? It was when I was doing a Skunkworks build, and it was when I had, this is all online, by the way, you can find the video. My frustration was very evident. It was when I did the green tubing that was the wrong shade of green. It looked more jade than green. But anyway, it was I think it was for sure SLI. It might've been triple SLI or 3-way SLI. I had spent 2 solid days with like no sleep building the system. Got it all plumbed, got it all filled, and I noticed that the system wouldn't post. And it wouldn't post if I had all of the RAM slots occupied. And it turned out it had a bad RAM slot on the motherboard. Now at that point, like any consumer, I lost my shit. And in this video, I lost it on video and just called out MSI and every name you could possibly think of, because my frustration level was an all-time high that I was on no sleep. Now knowing the work I had to go through to tear it down, to get the rig apart, just to swap out the motherboard. And by swap, I was like, I'm not using another Godlike, fuck that. So I went with another motherboard. And guess what? When you change out motherboards, the CPU doesn't always land in the same spot. So I had to rebend and replumb and change out all my fittings and my tubing and rebend and all that. So I just absolutely swore off MSI products forever when it came to motherboards. I had a very similar situation with Gigabyte when it was in the orange scheme, because I went to a Gigabyte orange motherboard. I can't remember what the brand or like what the model was, but it was definitely like an X99 or an X299 board. And then I just had so many BIOS problems with the Gigabyte board. Like Gigabyte was known to just have BIOS problems galore. But I'm now running a Gigabyte motherboard once again in my home station and my workstation here at work, and they have been utterly solid. Well, with the exception of my workstation board right now upstairs deciding it wants to sit on the post screen for 25 seconds before it starts to try and boot Windows. Although I haven't done a BIOS update on that, and it could be one of my USB devices or peripherals that's causing it to hang. But that's just started out of nowhere, and it's annoying, but it's not blocking me from using the system. But again, there's times I swore I would never use another brand because I was so frustrated with them, but things change. So you gotta also keep an open mind and be willing to accept change from brands and do your research to determine whether or not you're willing to give them your money. Because ultimately, you're the boss. It's your money, you're buying the stuff, and the brands work for you, not the other way around. Although a lot of brands seem to think you work for them, right? It's a weird time that we live in. Anyway, time to get out of here. I just wanted to give some food for thought that yes, brand does matter for many different reasons, but those reasons are constantly changing as the families of graphics cards change, right? 50 series taught us a whole new way that brands could screw up outside of just NVIDIA, but they're inventing new ways to screw up these days. But I challenge you in the comments down below to put your most trusted brand and why, and then be prepared to defend that comment to the death, because people are going to probably try and crucify you for liking a brand that they hate. And they are going to obviously defend their position. So, good luck.